Dublin was still asleep when the emergency call came in. It was shortly before 4:30 on Wednesday morning. On Lower Road, near the strawberry beds in Lucan, a motorcycle had left the road. No other vehicle was believed to have been involved. Emergency workers treated the rider at the scene, but there was nothing more they could do. The man was Glen Hansard. By the time daylight spread across the city, one of Ireland's most familiar voices was gone. He was only 56. There was no long illness for the public to prepare for. No farewell tour. No carefully chosen final performance where everyone understood that an ending was approaching. Glen had remained active, curious, and closely connected to the music that had shaped nearly his entire life. That is part of what made the news so difficult to accept. His representatives announced his death with broken hearts and said that his family was still trying to understand what had happened. Behind the famous name were his wife, the Finnish poet Meri Saritsa, and their young son, Kristi. Glen had become a father for the first time at 52, and he had spoken with almost boyish wonder about how completely the experience had changed him. For decades, his days had revolved around songs, rehearsals, journeys, and crowded rooms. Then Kristi arrived, and suddenly the smallest routines mattered. In a 2023 interview with The Irish Times, Glen described days with his son as beautifully simple. He admitted that both parents were exhausted, but he sounded grateful for every part of it. Now that boy will grow up hearing his father's voice through recordings. He will see the battered guitar. He will watch the small Irish film that carried Glen from the streets of Dublin to the Academy Awards. He will hear strangers tell him that Falling Slowly played at their wedding, helped them through a loss, or reminded them of someone they once loved. But he will not have the years with his father that everyone assumed were still ahead. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and leave a few words for Glen in the comments. Perhaps tell us where you first heard his voice. For some, it was in The Commitments. For others, it was Once. And for many in Dublin, he was simply the intense young man with the worn guitar who could stop people in the street. Police were still investigating the circumstances of the crash. The exact details of Glen's final journey had not been made public, and there is no honest reason to fill that silence with guesses. What we do know is painful enough. Sometime during that dark Dublin morning, a husband and father was expected to return home. A musician still had songs to finish, stages to revisit, and friends who believed there would always be another night together. Instead, Ireland awakened to a death that seemed to make no sense. And to understand why Glen Hansard's absence feels so personal to so many people, we have to return to the streets where his story began, long before the Oscar, before Once, and before the world knew his name. Long before Glen Hansard became associated with red carpets, awards, and sold-out theaters, he learned how to perform in a place where nobody was required to listen. He was born in Dublin in April 1970 and spent his early years in Ballymun, a working-class area known for its tall, concrete apartment blocks. Music was already pulling at him, but school was not. Glen later recalled that his headmaster recognized this and supported his decision to leave at 13. It was an extraordinary age to step away from the classroom. Most children of 13 were still being told where to sit and what to study. Glen was standing on Dublin streets with a guitar, hoping that passing strangers might stop long enough to hear him. Busking gave him an education of a different kind. There were no guaranteed audiences and no polite applause at the end of a song. People could listen, offer a coin, or continue walking without even turning their heads. Glen had to learn quickly how to reach them. He watched faces. He felt when a crowd was drifting away. He discovered that a song had to be honest enough to hold someone who had somewhere else to be. Those years also shaped the way he performed for the rest of his life. Even when he later stood before thousands of people, there was still something of the street musician in him. He sang as though he needed to earn the attention of every person in the room. By his late teens, Glen was trying to build something more permanent. He recorded early demonstrations of his music and eventually formed the Frames in Dublin in 1990. The name reportedly came from the bicycle frames that gathered around his family home after he spent time repairing bikes for friends. It was an ordinary Dublin detail, slightly untidy and entirely unglamorous, which suited the band perfectly. The Frames did not become an overnight international sensation. They built their following through small venues, long drives, and performances that could feel almost painfully intense. In Ireland, however, people began to notice. Glen was no longer simply the young man singing on the pavement. He was becoming the leader of a band with its own voice. Then cinema entered his life almost by accident. Director Alan Parker was preparing The Commitments, a film about a group of young Dublin musicians trying to form a soul band. More than 1,500 people reportedly attended the open auditions, carrying guitars, whistles, banjos, and almost anything else they could play. Glen had not arrived with a carefully prepared plan to become an actor. According to accounts he later gave, he accompanied a friend and found himself drawn into the audition process. Parker eventually cast him as Outspan Foster, the band's quiet, long-haired guitarist. Released in 1991, The Commitments introduced Glen's face to audiences far beyond Dublin. Yet fame through acting left him uneasy. Music was the life he had chosen. He worried that people might remember the character and overlook the songs he was struggling to build with the Frames. For years afterward, strangers would still call him Outspan. Glen kept playing anyway. He returned to the band, to crowded Irish rooms, and to the battered guitar that already seemed like part of his body. The film had opened a door, but it had not yet revealed the strange path waiting beyond it. That would come later, through another small Dublin film. This time, Glen would not simply play a musician. He would play a version of the life he already knew. Years after, The Commitments, another film brought Glen Hansard back in front of a camera. This time, there were no large audition rooms, no polished sets, and almost no money. The film was called Once. Its director, John Carney, knew Glen from his years playing bass with the Frames. He wanted to make a quiet story about two musicians who meet in Dublin, begin writing songs together, and form a connection that neither of them can easily explain. Glen was initially brought in to help with the music and share stories from his years as a street performer. He was not supposed to become the leading man. Actor Cillian Murphy had been considered for the role, but the arrangement fell apart. Carney then turned to Glen, who agreed only after being assured that the film would remain small, intimate, and close to the life he understood. That smallness was visible everywhere. Once was filmed in just 17 days with a skeleton crew. Natural light replaced expensive studio equipment. Friends' homes became locations. Glen's own apartment was used for one of the musical scenes, and ordinary people sometimes walked through the Dublin street shots without realizing that a film was being made. Much of the dialogue felt spontaneous, because some of it truly was. Beside Glen was Markéta Irglova, a young Czech pianist and songwriter with whom he had already begun making music. On screen, they were known simply as Guy and Girl. Their characters never needed glamorous clothes or carefully written speeches. They sat at a piano, walked through Dublin, and slowly learned how to listen to one another. The scene most viewers remembered took place inside a music shop. Glen began playing guitar. Markéta joined him at the piano. Their voices met on Falling Slowly, a song that sounded less like a performance than a private conversation someone had accidentally overheard. That moment carried the entire spirit of the film. There were no dancers behind them. No orchestra rose to tell the audience how to feel. The camera simply remained near two people making music together, allowing the pauses and uncertain glances to do as much work as the lyrics. When Once reached audiences in 2007, its modest scale became part of its appeal. Viewers who were tired of polished Hollywood romances found something recognizable in it. The characters cared for each other, but life did not conveniently clear every obstacle from their path. The film traveled much farther than anyone involved had expected. Then, in February 2008, Glen and Marquita walked onto the stage at the Academy Awards after Falling Slowly was named Best Original Song. Glen looked overwhelmed. He had spent his adolescence asking strangers on Dublin streets to spare a moment for a song. Now, millions of people were watching him hold an Oscar. Marquita's acceptance speech became part of the evening as well. The orchestra had initially begun before she could speak, but host Jon Stewart invited her back so she could finish. For two musicians from a tiny Irish film, the moment felt almost impossible. Success followed. Glen and Marquita toured as The Swell Season, and, once later, became a stage musical that found its own international audience. But the Oscar did not turn Glen into someone who belonged only to red carpets. He still preferred worn guitars, crowded rooms, and songs that sounded as though they might fall apart in the middle. The award made the world recognize him. It did not remove the street musician who had learned years earlier that one honest song could stop a person in their tracks. And behind that remarkable rise, Glen was also carrying experiences that were far more difficult to place inside a victory speech. Success gave Glen Hansard a larger audience, but it did not make his life simpler. After Once, the Oscar and years of touring with The Swell Season, strangers often saw only the remarkable ending to a familiar dream. A Dublin street musician had reached Hollywood. His songs were being performed around the world. Yet Glen still had to live inside the sudden attention, the constant travel, and the pressure of being associated with one particular film and one particular song. His relationship with Markéta Irglova changed during those years. They had shared music, travel, and a period of romantic closeness, but the relationship did not last. They continued to respect one another and eventually returned to recording and performing together. The Swell Season released new music as recently as 2025, showing that the creative bond survived long after their private lives had moved in separate directions. Then, during the summer of 2010, Glen witnessed something no performer could have been prepared for. The Swell Season was playing at the Mountain Winery in Saratoga, California. It was an outdoor concert in a striking venue built against the hills. Glen and Marquita were on stage when a man fell from the roof above and landed near the performers. He died at the scene. People in the audience had come expecting an evening of music. Instead, they watched emergency workers enter the stage while the concert came to an abrupt end. The group later arranged and paid for counseling for audience members who had witnessed what happened. Glen rarely turned the incident into a public performance of grief. He spoke about it when necessary, but he did not use it to draw attention to himself. One person who understood something of that burden was Eddie Vedder. After hearing what had happened, Vedder contacted Glen. Their friendship grew from that conversation, partly because Vedder had lived through his own terrible experience when 9 people died during Pearl Jam's performance at the Roskilde Festival in 2000. In the years that followed, Glen toured with Vedder and joined him on stage many times. Their friendship was visible in the easy way they shared songs, but its beginning came from an act of private kindness during a moment when words were difficult to find. Glen's response to suffering could also be seen every Christmas in Dublin. He returned to the streets not as the unknown teenager who once needed coins, but as an Oscar-winning musician gathering other artists to help people without homes. On Christmas Eve, crowds formed around Glen, Bono, Imelda May, and other Irish performers as they sang in the city centre for the Dublin Simon community. The annual busk raised more than $2 million for homelessness services over the years. There was something fitting about Glen standing there with his battered guitar. He knew how quickly people could walk past someone on a pavement. He had spent his youth trying to make them stop. Decades later, he was asking them to stop again, this time for people whose names they might never know. Awards revealed what Glen achieved. Those Christmas evenings revealed the kind of man he was when no trophy was being presented. And by the time he entered his 50s, another part of his life was about to matter more to him than any stage he had ever stood upon. For most of Glen Hansard's life, music decided the shape of his days. There was always another rehearsal, another train, another flight, or another room waiting for him somewhere. He had spent decades living according to the needs of songs and audiences. Even success had not made that rhythm quieter. Then, at the age of 52, Glen became a father. His son, Christy, was born in October 2022. Glen married the Finnish poet Mere Saritsa later that year, and the family divided its time between Ireland and Helsinki. In Finland, he discovered something he rarely experienced in Dublin. He could walk through the city without being watched, recognized, or expected to perform. He could simply be Mere's husband and Christy's father. When Glen spoke about fatherhood, he did not sound like a man offering a polished answer for an interview. He sounded surprised by his own happiness. For 52 years, he said, he had been the most important person in his own life. The arrival of his son changed that almost immediately. His career, his worries, and even many of the thoughts that had occupied him for years suddenly became secondary. The days he described were not dramatic. They were built around small tasks, tired mornings, and the constant attention a young child requires. Both parents were exhausted. Glen admitted that openly. Yet he also spoke about those days as beautifully simple. Being present mattered. If his mind wandered elsewhere, he felt he was not doing the job properly. That was a remarkable change for someone who had spent so much of his life leaving one place for the next. There had been years when Glen could disappear into a song, travel for weeks, and follow wherever the music led. A child did not care about an Oscar, a sold-out theater, or a standing ovation. Christy needed his father to sit beside him, notice him, and remain in the room. Glen seemed to welcome that responsibility. He said that serving this young mind and young life had given him an entirely different view of himself. He even wondered why he had waited so long, before adding that perhaps the teacher only arrives when the student is ready. There is now a terrible weight behind those words. Christy was only 3 when his father died. Glen had spent years singing about love, separation, and the people we are unable to hold on to. But this was not a story written for an album. It was a family that expected more ordinary mornings, more journeys between Helsinki and Ireland, and more time for a little boy to understand the man carrying him through the world. Mary and Christy were among the people left behind when Glen's motorcycle crashed before dawn in Dublin. His representatives asked that the privacy of his family be respected while they face the shock of his death. There will be recordings, photographs, and stories for his son. There will be the worn guitar, the films, and the night his father stood on the Academy Awards stage. There will be people who tell Christy how Glen helped them, encouraged them, or made them stop on a Dublin street to listen. But those things cannot replace the years everyone believed they still had. And Glen was not stepping away from the world when he died. He was still recording, traveling, and making plans. The family life he had found after 50 was growing alongside a career that was still moving forward. That unfinished future would make the mourning of his death even harder to understand. Glen Hansard was not looking back on a finished career during the months before his death. He was still moving. In April 2026, he performed a 2-hour concert at Washington's 930 Club before returning to Europe for a 16-date tour with his full band. The schedule began in Paris and carried him through theaters and concert halls across Britain and the continent. More performances were already being advertised for later in the year, including a November appearance at Belfast's Ulster Hall. There was new music as well. His live collection, Don't Settle, Transmissions East, had been released only months earlier. Venues promoting the tour also described Glen as preparing a new solo album. Friends later spoke of further music being planned, although some details had not yet been formally announced. That matters because Glen's death did not come at the end of a long withdrawal from public life. He had not quietly packed away his guitar. His calendar still contained cities he expected to visit, rooms he expected to fill, and songs he believed he would have time to complete. Earlier in 2026, he had also returned to the kind of venues that shaped him. The Frames played intimate concerts around Ireland to draw attention to small independent music spaces. Glen understood what those rooms meant. Long before an Oscar placed him before millions of viewers, small stages had given him somewhere to grow, fail, and return the following night. He worried that younger performers might lose those opportunities if local venues continued disappearing. He was still protecting the road behind him while walking toward whatever came next. Then, before sunrise on July 29th, that future stopped. The tributes that followed showed how widely Glen's life had reached. Bruce Springsteen remembered a great musician, a generous friend, and a gracious man. Bono described him as a man who carried the force of an entire choir, while musicians including Cat Power, Sharon Van Etten, and Imelda May struggled to put their shock into words. The official announcement on Glen's website was much simpler. With broken hearts, his management wrote, they were announcing his passing in the early hours of that morning. There was no explanation large enough to make the news feel reasonable. A tour schedule could be cancelled. An unfinished recording might someday be heard, or it might remain with the people who helped create it. The guitar could be placed carefully inside its case. But at home, Mary and their young son faced a silence that no public tribute could fill. That is what makes Glen Hansard's final night so difficult to consider. He did not know he was completing the last ordinary hours of his life. Those around him did not know they were entering their final day with him. Everyone believed there would be another conversation, another journey between Dublin and Helsinki, another Christmas song on Grafton Street, and another evening when Glen would lean into his damaged guitar and sing as though the room contained only one listener. There was always supposed to be another song. Now, when Falling Slowly begins, many people will hear something different inside it. Some will remember once. Others will remember a wedding, a journey, or someone they once loved. And some will think of a little boy who will come to know much of his father through the memories of strangers. Where did you first hear Glen Hansard's voice, and which of his songs will stay with you? Share that memory below, and subscribe to the channel as we continue remembering the artists whose music became part of our own lives.